Listen, I just want to share a story that I read last night on Kiwi blog, which is one of those so-called unofficial news sources that, frankly, there are times that you read Kiwi blog and other blogs like it in this country, and you go, why aren't the mainstream media reporting that story? And it's the reason, I guess, the platform exists as well. Why are we discussing stories that the mainstream media wish to studiously ignore? I have a bit of a view that, quite a strong view in actual fact, that as a consequence of the Public Interest Journalism Fund and the strings that were attached to mainstream media, that there was a directive from the last government, in particular from Willie Jackson, who was overseeing the distribution of those monies, that the mainstream media were required to beef up their Maori reporting. So that didn't just mean reporting on Maori issues, but it also meant employing more Maori staff and even setting up in some of our mainstream media, including the public broadcasters, Maori sections dedicated to Maori stories by Maori journalists. And unsurprisingly, with the if you like, an historic legacy of impartiality disappeared with that funding and with the establishment of that units. Then that was accompanied by a sort of, I guess, woke conversion that went on in mainstream media. Perhaps the best example I could give you that would be of Stuff, the former Fairfax newspapers and media outlet, which decided that they needed to apologise and went through an entirely long and lengthy mea culpa for any anti-Maori stories that they'd actually written, even though they might have been factually correct. So now I've noticed that from Stuff, Radio New Zealand, Television New Zealand, again, generously funded by the Public Interest Journalism Fund, to an extent, the New Zealand Herald as well, there is an aversion to reporting negative Maori stories, even if they are negative. Now, this isn't to suggest that New Zealand Herald, and they didn't, have shied away from the issues related to John Tamahere or what seems to be the taxpayer-funded fiefdom that he and his Te Pāti Māori associates have created for themselves, because they did uncover that story, and they have continued to do so, and they need to be complimented for it. Although it certainly didn't come out of Radio New Zealand, TVNZ or Stuff. That story was from the New Zealand Herald. But in general, there are other stories that do not seem to get as much coverage. Can I give you the really good example of that? Would be the number of young Maori children who are abused each year, or who are killed or severely injured to the point of permanent disability. Now, as every New Zealander knows, but mainstream media don't want to touch the story now, the level of Maori child abuse in this country is a national scandal. It's so much of a national scandal in this country that if you were to remove Maori from our child abuse and child homicide stats in this country, we would be one of the safest places in New Zealand for small children. If you add Māori to the statistics, we are one of the most dangerous in the Western world. So it does give you some indication of the nature of the problem. Now, the reason we don't talk about this anymore, at least from a mainstream media's perspective, is because it has the potential, I guess, or does, expose Māori culture and Te Ao Māori in a negative light. And because there is this view that Māori need to be positively covered in our mainstream media, and that was, in actual fact, almost a directive from the Public Interest Journalism Fund to mainstream media, with specific improvement in the number of Māori journalists and the Māori perspective being carried in those funded organisations, that has continued to this day. So even though the funding might have gone away, the change in emphasis, the people who have been employed, the separate Maori sections that exist, Radio New Zealand, the classic example, of course, still exist and are still maintained. And unsurprisingly, that's why you'll find, for example, with the hikoi to do with the Treaty Principles Bill, you might almost have been excused for thinking that Radio New Zealand News and Current Affairs was a leading promoter of that particular hikoi. It didn't just provide coverage of it, it provided, if you like, sympathetic sponsorship of it. Okay. So the next story that I'm going to give you is also a negative story, but one that isn't covered by the mainstream media, for I've just suggested to you the reasons that I've suggested to you. And it is covered by Kiwi Blog, but it is illustrative of a problem we've got that no one seems to acknowledge. So all of the Maori stories of the last 6 months, I guess, have been pretty much around a reaction to the actions of this coalition government, including the Treaty Principles Bill, but not confined to it. The real problem is not what the centre-right government is doing in terms of its policies in that particular area at all, because this centre-right government and all of the parties that make up its constituency, and I would imagine 99% of its supporters, all want Mori to succeed. And with the reason why we all want Mori to succeed as people and as a culture is because it is critical to the future of this country that they do. And we're not just talking about Maori becoming, if you like, the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel, which is they don't work at all and they're supported by the state, and that's the sort of constitutional role they play. As a sort of, I don't know, what would you call them? A sort of a cultural isolation, which is funded completely by the rest of Israel, never, including not serving in the military. It's a bizarre operation they've got over there, but apparently they've got a hotline to God, so they're given this special dispensation. But we don't want Maori to end up like that. We want Maori integrated into our society. We want to make sure that they are succeeding, that they become the entrepreneurs, the business people, the surgeons, the dentists, not the lawyers, preferably, go and get a decent job, of our country. And they become not welfare beneficiaries in the main, but they become functioning taxpayers and leading this country into the world. So we all want Maori to succeed. Which is why the next story I'm going to give you very, very quickly now is so critical, because it shows exactly the opposite. And no one wants to talk about it. And unless you talk about a problem, you won't be able to solve it. Lindsay Mitchell is a right-wing, conservative, I think Catholic researcher of unimpeachable quality. But it's her research that has now been picked up and published by Kiwi Blog, checked out for its veracity and confirmed. And it goes like this. In 2024 last year, there were 17,000 Maori babies born in New Zealand. 17,000, 17. And according to official information response from the Ministry of Social Development, 6,000 of them were dependent on welfare by the end of the year. So that's 35% of all Maori babies born in 2024. Their parent or caregiver was dependent on welfare by the end of last year. Now, most would have actually been born onto the benefit, over a third of all Maori babies last year. And of the 17,300 born in 2023, that's the previous year, 7,700 were on a benefit by aged 2. So that's 44.5% of all Maori children born in 2023. Now, the equivalent percentage for non-Maori babies are respectively 11% and 15%. Against 35% and essentially 40%. Now, these extraordinarily high Māori numbers aren't due to unemployment. Just 1 in 10 of the Māori babies born last year became dependent on a job seeker benefit. 80% have sole parents. The future expected time on a social welfare or a sole parent benefit in this country is 17 years. So growing up in homes where nobody works, writes Lindsay Mitchell, is bad for children. They are more exposed to transience, abuse, neglect, violence, poor educational outcomes, poor health outcomes, and substance abuse. Now, I would have thought just quietly that if I was a Māori activist or a Māori political leader, and whichever political party that I might be, if I was working in the Māori media, I might be addressing that issue above all else because it represents the most obvious and existing danger to Māori achievement in this country. But we can't even get these facts reported, and they won't even be reported by the Ministry of Social Development unless you request such information under the Official Information Act. This is cowardice on an institutional and on a media scale. We want to walk away from problems and by not even acknowledging that they exist. They do exist, and they are killing New Zealand's progress and the achievement of Māori people on a daily basis. Those are my thoughts on that particular issue. Great thanks to Lindsay Mitchell and Kiwi Blog for publishing something that the rest of New Zealand's media